Welcome in, Hokies fans, to this week's second edition of the Tech Sideline Podcast. The Virginia Tech football team has assembled their staff heading into spring ball and heading into the upcoming season. A lot to unpack there. It's all coming up on episode 289 of the Tech Sideline Podcast. And we start things right now. We record on Wednesday, March 15th, 2023, from our high-tech studio at the Virginia Tech Corporate Research Center right here in Blacksburg, Virginia. We welcome you in, whether you are listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you consume your podcast, or if you're watching on YouTube. If you do happen to be on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe while you're there, and also turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any future TSL content. Tech Sideline is presented by First Bank and Trust Company. First Bank and Trust Company is the bank that puts you first. Visit www.firstbank.com to learn more. All right, gentlemen, I think some introductions are in order. To my right, lead analyst and columnist Chris Coleman. Across the way, managing editor David Cunningham. And behind the scenes, producing today, founder and general manager Will Stewart. Dancing to our jungle music in the intro. And of course, I'm your host, Giovanni Heater. We thank you for being with us. And let's go ahead and dive right into it. Let's talk about these new additions to the Virginia Tech coaching staff. Starting first off with the new running backs coach, Elijah Brooks, coming from the University of Maryland.
I think he ticks every box. He's been a successful running backs coach at Maryland. He's only been a running backs coach there for 4 years before being the head coach at DeMatha, but he's put 3 or 4 backs in the NFL. So he seems to be a good developer of talent. He's recruited a number of 4-star prospects to Maryland from that area, and even he's gone as far away as Michigan to recruit a 4-star running back. But and I know when people talk about recruiting, they want to see the star rankings. And yes, to me, that's important to a certain extent to be able to go head-to-head with big schools for players like that. But also I want to point out that Maryland's best running back this past year was a redshirt freshman. He rushed for almost 1,000 yards and caught 33 passes. Coming out of high school, he was the 40th ranked player in Maryland. If Virginia Tech signed the 40th ranked player in Maryland, our fans would be mad about it. Right? They would think, oh, it's going to drag our recruiting class ranking down, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, and then he comes out and rushes for 1,000 yards and catches 33 passes. So shows to me that shows Brooks is also a good evaluator, because not every recruit you sign is going to be a 4-star recruit. Most of them are not, of course. So it's good. It's still more about evaluation and development and things like that. So when you consider being able to go head to head with top schools for 4-star players, being able to evaluate lower ranked guys, being able to actually coach and put players in the NFL, and being a terrific regional fit within the footprint. Former head coach at DeMatha, former player at DeMatha, William and Mary graduate. You know how I feel about William and Mary graduates in football coaching. I think he ticks every single box you're looking for.
What did you call him in your article? The Maryland Fontel Mines?
The Fontel Mines of D.C., Maryland.
Yeah,
I know. I like that.
Yeah, I think he fits in Virginia Tech. Gives Tech another presence in the DMV. Obviously, Tyler Bowen, that was kind of his area, in Maryland, so to speak. But he was at DeMatha for 7 years, and then was at Maryland. So he knows Maryland very, very, very well. Price said he was somebody that he and James Franklin looked at hiring when they were at Penn State. Right. He's a guy that Brent Price got to know because he recruited DeMatha a lot. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there are what, 1 or 2 players from Tech on Tech's roster that are from DeMatha?
My boy Dante Lovett.
Yeah,
he's going to be here
coming.
This summer.
Yeah, I knew there was one. Of course, Mike Jones, men's basketball, yeah. Rodney Rice. But I do think he's a good addition, and he adds both a good presence in terms of philosophy. He fits the scheme, what Tech's trying to do with the running backs, and he also is a really good recruiter. And Price said, and Tyler Bowen, offensive coordinator, said that he's a guy, Brooks is a guy that he's known for a long time because he's recruited Maryland. Mm-hmm. So he was well known in coaching circles and stuff. He was somebody that Tech, I think Price said he initially thought about maybe hiring at Tech. So he's a guy that Tech's thought about for a while, and I think he's a good fit. I think he'll do really well. Of course, that shifts Stu Holt to tight ends, but that's a position he's familiar with.
One last comment on Brooks. He has coached or played under a lot of legends. So even for basketball. So when he played at DeMatha, he played football and basketball. He played for Bill McGregor, who has over 300 wins as DeMatha's head coach, is considered a legend in this region. Morgan Wooten, their longtime basketball coach, over 1,200 wins in his career. Legend. And then Jimmy Laycock at William & Mary was his coach. Jimmy Laycock, Hall of Famer coach at that level. Outstanding coach. So this guy has coached under some outstanding coaching minds. So, and you've got to figure a lot of that is rubbed off. So I couldn't possibly be more happy than I am with the running back hire.
Always good news to hear. Last question on Coach Brooks for both of you. And you kind of answered it, but I'll ask you to elaborate on it. Brent Pry said that he was at the tip top of a very short list. If you had to pick one characteristic or maybe a couple, why would that be?
Because region. I think the region ties. That's and you'll notice when we talk about Ron Crook in a sec, he also has region ties. That's important to Virginia Tech, right? Every single person on the staff has a region tie, and it's somebody the staff has been familiar with, whether it's Pry himself or somebody else, right? I think that's huge. He's going to be a huge recruiting boost in the state of Maryland, I think. You just plucked one of Maryland's a good recruiter that was recruiting guys to Maryland. Now he's recruiting guys to Virginia Tech. And on top of that, he's shown he can develop good running back talent. I think those two things go hand in hand. It's kind of like Fontel Mines, like we said, right? Good recruiter in the Commonwealth, and he can develop good wide receivers.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much exactly it. I think we heard a couple of other names for the running backs job, one in particular. And the resume there was fine, but like the regional ties for Brooks, I think breaks the tie, so to speak. And I'm not even sure, even if it wasn't regional ties, I wouldn't have preferred Brooks anyway, just because of all those other things we talked about. So there was certainly a short list, but I think Brooks is kind of a no-brainer. I would challenge you to find somebody that's a better fit for Virginia Tech and what we need.
So how did Virginia Tech kind of pluck Elijah Brooks out of Maryland and take him away from Mike Loxley and the Terps?
Well, Virginia Tech hasn't announced their new staff salaries yet, but he made $231,000 at Maryland, and I bet he makes $400,000 at Virginia Tech. And
that'll do it.
Right, and a lower cost of living. So, and plus, some guys are just, they like to add to their resume.
Right.
Maybe he wants to be a coordinator or a head coach one day, and you can't get jobs like that if you've just coached at one place your whole career. So there could be a number of factors into it, but I think he's been in this region for a long time. He grew up there, played at William & Mary. I'm sure he has great respect for the Virginia Tech program because he's seen it from afar. But so I'm sure there's a number of factors involved, but Maryland's financial support for their football program is not as high as Virginia Tech's, and I'm sure that has something to do with it as well.
I mean, Pry got a big budget for his staff for a reason, and I think that is coming into play. We saw the same thing with retaining Fontel Mines.
All right, let's go ahead and move on to Virginia Tech's new offensive line coach, Ron Crook, coming most recently from the University of South Dakota, and before that, spent time at Cincinnati. Now, here's something that's interesting. When he was at South Dakota, run game coordinator and a tight ends coach, but at Cincinnati, he was an offensive line coach. That was his most recent job as an O-line coach. Did a great job at Cincinnati. Something I thought very interesting about him is Brent Pry said they had names from the SEC and the Big 12 in serious contention for this spot, and he said Ron Crook was our guy, and that's who they picked.
There was a Missouri offensive line coach, and I forget his name, but he used to be an offensive line coach for Joe Moorhead at Mississippi State, and that's from the Tyler Bowen School of Offense, what have you. So that would make sense that he would be on there. Crook, I think that there are so many ties. Like, he grew up in West Virginia. He coached in the same small college conference that Brent Pry's dad coached in for a long Glenville State.
SBAC?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
They know a lot of the same people. So it makes it easy to when you have references from people that the head coach trusts. Plus, I mean, he did good work at Cincinnati and West Virginia. If you just look at the
Stanford,
right. If you just look at the players he coached there and their run offenses and things like that, he seems to be a very well qualified coach. And from a recruiting standpoint, he's basically a like for like replacement from Joe Rudolph. All coaches use their offensive line coach as a O-line recruiting specialist these days, meaning the offensive linemen from the state of Virginia or wherever, they're going to be recruited by the offensive line coach. But they also have their own territory to a certain extent. And from his days at Cincinnati, his days at West Virginia, he's recruited Pennsylvania, especially Western Pennsylvania. He's recruited Ohio. He's recruited West Virginia. He's even recruited Indiana to a certain extent. And all of those were Joe Rudolph areas when he was here. So he's a qualified coach. There's plenty of familiarity between him and Brent Pry. And I think he's a like-for-like replacement for Rudolph on the recruiting trail. So it's kind of a seamless transition. And Tyler Bowen also used a phrase towards the end of his talk yesterday where he said it was very important to him to hire an offensive line coach that was flexible. I wonder sometimes how flexible Joe Rudolph is. I think he's an excellent offensive line coach, but things may have to be set up in a certain way for him to be an excellent offensive line coach. And if the fit wasn't there, then it doesn't matter if he's a good coach. I mean, you would rather have two average coaches than like one good coach and one bad coach who don't see eye to eye, or even two good coaches who don't see eye to eye. Because if they don't see eye to eye and their ideas are different and they're not on the same page, then it's just not going to work. So I think a big emphasis in this hiring process for offensive line coach was to your philosophies fit the offensive coordinator's philosophies. So it just seems on paper, and if that part of it is okay, there's been a ton of evidence that Crook is an excellent offensive line coach. He's done it at multiple schools. He's put plenty of offensive linemen in the NFL. He's had plenty of all-conference players. So if that doesn't happen at Virginia Tech, then it's something else.
Yeah, right.
Something else is the problem other than Crook. Right.
Yeah, so I'll read you what I wrote in my story yesterday because I want to go in a little deeper on those West Virginia connections because I asked Pry. He mentioned the Maryland ties for Brooks in terms of they have known about him for a real long time. But Crook is somebody with completely different ties. Pry's father, Jim, coached at West Liberty State in 1981. Crook played there from 86 to 88. Jim Pry's father, was at West Virginia Tech for 3 years. Crook was on staff there for a year. Pry's mother, Kathy, graduated from Glenville State. Crook coached there for 2 years. And in the 2 years Pry spent coaching with his dad and mentoring James Franklin at East Stroudsburg, he faced Clarion, a fellow PSAC school institution, and Crook coached there for 1 year or a couple of years, 3 years, I think, and he led them to the Division II playoffs. So, like, those West Virginia ties are huge. In my opinion, his fit is perfect because he wants to do exactly what Tyler Bowen wants to do schematically, and he has all the region ties.
Mm-hmm. I've got Brandon Patterson, who is an analyst for us. He's working on an article on Crook and his blocking schemes and his philosophies and things like that. So we'll have more information from an X's and O's standpoint after he does that research. But based on what I know now, that seems like a good hire for Virginia Tech.
Yeah. Now, a question that some fans might have, and it's an opportunity to possibly answer that question, is, okay, so helps take Cincinnati to the college football playoff in 2021, which is something that nobody else on the resume on the Virginia Tech staff right now has on their resume, is a college football playoff appearance, especially as recent as that, and then leaves to go to the University of South Dakota. Why is that? Why do you leave Cincinnati and go to a smaller school like South Dakota?
I believe Cincinnati changed offensive coordinators and new offensive coordinators like generally like to bring in a couple of their own coaches, and you become the odd man out. I mean, we could see it could be the same thing, even maybe at Maryland with Brooks, because they have a new offensive coordinator now.
Maybe he was looking for a job already.
Maybe I don't think that's the case with Brooks at Maryland, because he's got such great in-state recruiting ties, and I would not want to give that up if I was Maryland. But you know, that's just the way of it in college sports.
Yeah, no, I probably the same thing. But I do think for Crook, his experience speaks for itself, right? He's coached for 30 plus years in the industry. Coached at smaller schools, helped elevate smaller schools, but also coached tight ends at Stanford, coached at West Virginia. He's from Parkersburg. He's coached at Cincinnati. He's coached around the region. And this is somebody that, you know, here's what I'll say. If Pry felt more comfortable with him than some of the, like, whatever SEC and Big 12 coaches that made the final list, I think that says a lot about who he is and his ties. And I think from everything we heard yesterday, it seems like he's going to be a really good fit.
I think Tyler Bowen was involved heavily in this hire too. Not to suggest that he wasn't involved heavily last year, but he was also still the tight ends coach for the Jags during that whole process. Mm-hmm. So it's not this simple, but I don't know if the process was as detailed. I'm not saying just like Pry called up Bowen and said, "Hey, what do you think about Joe Rudolph as your offensive line coach? Hey, that'd be great. Hire him." And that was it. But I do think just because Bowen is here in coaching now, he was more thoroughly involved in the search than he would have been last year.
Anything else on Elijah Brooks, the new running backs coach, or Ron Crook, the new offensive line coach?
I think we covered that about as well as we can.
All right, sounds good. Well, it's a good time to tell you that today's show also brought to you by the Hokie Way. At the Hokie Way, we work to support Virginia Tech, our student athletes, and our community. Together, we create a win for us all. Learn more about our mission and how to get involved. Go to thehokieway.org to learn more. All right, let's talk now about Tyler Bowen, Virginia Tech offensive coordinator, now moving to be the quarterbacks coach in place of Brad Glenn after his departure, which means that Stu Holt will now be the tight ends coach, filling Tyler Bowen's spot. So a little bit of mixing on the offensive side of the coaching staff. Brent Pry talked about it. Bowen touched on it, and so did Stu Holt yesterday in their press conferences. You guys were there. What are your thoughts on all of this?
Stu Holt has coached tight ends just as much, if not more, than he's coached running backs.
Yeah, that was his role at pretty much.
He was at Louisville
6 to 10 years.
Yeah,
that was his role.
Right. So I don't have an issue with that. He had very good running backs when he was at Appalachian State, but he's also coached tight ends at a whole bunch of different schools, including Louisville, before he came to Virginia Tech. So to me, this is like him switching to tight ends is the smallest of all the talking points with the staff reorganization. That's I don't have anything to say about it, really. Is that yeah, I'm fine with it.
Okay.
Makes sense.
David, anything else?
On a Holt? Well, I did think that what Holt said when I asked him was very interesting. He said, you know, I'm comfortable where I am. Like, I'm comfortable with moving there. But more importantly, it helps us get the play caller closer to the quarterback.
And it helps bring in the right running backs coach. Like, if you had kept Holt at running backs coach, then you couldn't hire Brooks. You know, you would have to go hire a new tight ends coach who maybe is not as good a fit for the program as Brooks is. So it's beneficial to have a versatile coach on the staff like Holt who can change positions to make room for a guy who I think is going to be a real asset for Virginia Tech.
All right, well, the more important thing, Tyler Bowen, quarterbacks coach, you mentioned him now being inside that quarterbacks room, working closer with his quarterbacks. The glaring question, never done it before. Break it down for us. Never played the position either. Brent Pry doesn't seem to have a problem with that.
I think if Virginia Tech was coming off a good year offensively, people wouldn't be making very much out of this. I can understand people's hesitation. So it's like, okay, we didn't have a good year offensively last year. People question whether Tyler Bowen is a good offensive coordinator or not, and now you're going to give him the quarterbacks, which is a position he's never coached, never played. Like, I agree on paper that doesn't make sense, but there are plenty of examples of coaches changing positions in the middle of their careers and being a smashing success. Many, there are examples at Virginia Tech. Jim Cavanaugh, who I think is a first ballot Hall of Famer. I'll shout it from the rooftops. He should be in the Hall of Fame at Virginia Tech. He never coached defense at college until he came to Virginia Tech. Like, he had been an offensive coordinator for Maryland, and he was an offensive coach at North Carolina. He turned out to be an elite defensive coach. Charlie Wiles, longtime defensive line coach at Virginia Tech. He was an offensive lineman in college and was mostly an offensive line coach before he came to Virginia Tech. And now he's a top-notch defensive line coach, first for Virginia Tech, now for NC State. Oh, my goodness. Kevin Rogers. Another William & Mary grad. He played linebacker at William & Mary, and then later became a quarterbacks coach. The difference there is, like, he got 8 years at Navy. That was his first quarterback coaching job. He wasn't in a Power 5 job or whatever. Ralph Friedgen, who was in his prime, was considered an offensive genius. Basically, he started out as an offensive line type coach and later became a quarterbacks coach and considered a very good one. The prime example of them all is a guy who, in my opinion, is one of the greatest football coaches of all time, Andy Reid. Mm-hmm. Was an offensive line coach until the Packers hired him in 1997 to be their quarterbacks coach. And then eventually became mentor to guys like Donovan McNabb. Eventually became mentor to, obviously, Mahomes now. So these are guys who did not have previous experience at the position that they eventually excelled at. So basically, my point here about Tyler Bowen is we don't know. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it works brilliantly. Sometimes it doesn't work. Just because he hasn't done it before doesn't mean it's not going to work. Because there are multiple examples of guys changing position and it working brilliantly. I think people are more inclined to question it because Tech had a bad year offensively with him as offensive coordinator. But I'll tell you this right now. The Tyler Bowen era at Virginia Tech is going to be decided by whether he's a good offensive coordinator or not. I don't think that's a lot more important than him coaching quarterbacks. I think a high school coach texted me the other night. Now, this guy's a Hall of Fame high school coach. And he pointed out to me that the higher level you get in football, the less it becomes about skill development and the more it's about helping your quarterback see things. Here's why we're doing this. Here's what you need to be looking for. Things like that. And I'm inclined to agree with that. Once you reach a certain point, it's like being a hitting coach in baseball. You want to be able to do tweaks here and there, but you don't want to mess with the whole swing. So I'll put it this way. I'm not worried about Bowen as quarterback. I'm not saying I'm not worried, but I'm more worried about him as offensive coordinator than I am as him at quarterbacks coach. My opinion hasn't changed on that at all. That's the biggest TBD.
I think, as I told somebody yesterday, the ball's in Bowen's court now.
Mm-hmm.
Bowen has all of the tools he needs to succeed, both as an offensive coordinator and as a quarterback coach, right? There's no excuse if something fails.
Sure.
He now has more. He already was spending time with the quarterbacks, which he mentioned and probably both mentioned yesterday. Now he's literally coaching the quarterbacks in everything. If there is a disconnect, like, there's no excuse for it. You know what I mean? I did think it was interesting that Prime mentioned, Prime Bowen mentioned that when Brad Glenn first left, it came up.
It goes back further than that. When Pry started saying that Bowen was working more and more with the quarterbacks later last season, and then he said, "This has been coming."
Yeah.
So it's almost like they had it in their minds that there was going to be staff changes at the end of this year, and the mix that they had wasn't the right fit.
They said that they almost did this at the beginning,
right,
from the get-go.
Correct.
As soon as Bowen got, they said they were very close, and then they didn't give reasons. They said for a couple different reasons we went another direction and decided to not make Bowen the quarterback's coach. But they almost did this from the get-go, David.
Right. Yeah, I think it's interesting. Pry's not shocked by it. Pry is like, I trust this guy, and. To Pry's point, I asked Pry about him. Pry was like, well, I never played linebacker, but I've coached a lot of really good ones. So, again, the ball's in Bowen's court, right? Bowen has all the tools he needs to be successful. He's in the quarterback's room now. He's mentoring those guys. From everything it sounds like, he's got a really good relationship with them. That's good. Okay, now go play well on the football field. I think that's it, right? It's, you can complain, you can like it, dislike the move, Bowen, the quarterback coach, all you want. Say, okay, well, he didn't have the experience. Pry's comfortable with it. Everybody else on staff's comfortable with it. The quarterbacks are comfortable with it. Now Tech's got to go out and win games, and the quarterbacks have to perform well. And like you said, I think it's more about the offense too, as a whole, right? You've got the right offensive line coach in there now. Somebody who fits your scheme, what you want to do schematically, that's good. You got a really good running backs coach. Your wide receiver coach is already pretty good. You got a good tight ends coach who moved from running back. Bowen has all the tools, both as a quarterbacks coach and an offensive coordinator. He needs to be successful. Go show it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they've improved their talent level through the transfer portal. More depth, more talent at wide receiver. I think they're better at running back now. They've got more depth at quarterback. I don't know who the starting quarterback is going to be. Whoever it is going to be better than last year. Either it's going to be an improved Grant Wells or it's going to be Kieran Drones beating out Grant Wells. I think the staff fit now is better, in my opinion. So they'll make strides this year if Tyler Bowen's a good offensive coordinator. If they don't make strides this year, then we'll know what the problem is. And that's where I want to be. We know it's all Bowen's offense now, right? We didn't necessarily know that last year. Now we know, and we can properly judge him.
Yeah.
You see, you're closer to seeing the light at the end of the tunnel now. We don't know exactly if the light of the tunnel is the sun or an incoming train, but at least we kind of know. We know it's a light. We're closer to having our final answer about Tyler Bowen, and I think that's very important.
What's interesting is part of me was thinking, I wonder if the reason why he had Glenn come up in the booth with him was because Glenn wasn't exactly doing what he wanted with the quarterbacks.
Who knows?
Like whatever happened, right? The offensive line didn't necessarily perform well at times. Maybe there was a disconnect between both Bowen and Rudolph, but also Bowen and Glenn, right? It's all possible.
Well, yeah. Brandon Patterson wrote an article for TSL last week where he went over Virginia Tech's blocking schemes game by game last week, and it varied wildly whether Tech was more of a gap scheme, whether they more of a zone scheme. It varied wildly on a week-to-week basis. So it almost kind of makes me believe that they weren't quite on the same page.
Yeah.
I do think, and that if coaches aren't on the same page, you cannot expect your players to perform at the level that they're capable of playing. And we saw last year almost everybody on the Tech offense get worse.
Yeah.
Caleb Smith accepted. So the same thing happens again this year. We'll know who the problem is.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Again, Bowen has all the tools, right? There should not be a disconnect. I believe it was Bowen said, Brooks and Crook, we basically spent all day in the office on Monday, and there was no disconnect. It was like I've known him, forever, right?
Right.
That's good. Go do it on the football field.
Sure.
I think, again, there are no excuses now.
Mm-hmm.
Question for you here, and I found this interesting. You said Brad Glenn was up in the booth with Bowen last year.
For part of the year.
For part of the year.
Yeah.
Do you think now that Bowen is the quarterback's coach and maybe would want to be closer, because this isn't the NFL where you have the mics and the helmets or anything like that. Do you think Bowen would move out of the booth and go to the sideline or stay
I don't
in the
think
booth?
so.
He's got the telephone.
Yeah, I figured.
Yeah,
Okay.
He's got the telephone, and I don't know exactly what analysts are allowed to do. What is
the reasons that he chooses to stay in the booth?
It's probably just what he's comfortable with and what he's done in the
can
past.
see it up there.
I can see how a defensive coordinator can call a game from the field. I mean, Bud did it for years. I don't see how an offensive coordinator calls it from the sideline. I guess different people have different feels for certain things, but if you were an offensive coordinator and you wanted to call the game from the sideline, you would really have to have a guy you trusted in the booth.
Right.
to
They
tell
have to
you
be
here's
your
what
eyes.
here's what we're seeing. Like Bud Foster was able to coach effectively from the sideline for so many years because he had Jim Cavanaugh in the booth, and Cavanaugh was a genius. And
Right.
Cavanaugh was a former offensive coach. He could see things from a defensive perspective and an offensive perspective. When Cav left, or when he was demoted and wasn't allowed to be a coach anymore, Virginia Tech's defensive performances got worse. So, like, Kavanaugh helped Bud Foster be an elite defensive coordinator. And so for Bowen to call it from the sideline, he would have to have somebody he really, really trusts in the booth. But most offensive coordinators aren't comfortable with that, and they stay in the booth.
All right. Anything coming up? We covered it last podcast, but again, I'll ask at the end of every show, what's coming up this week on TSL? So much stuff. Women's basketball, baseball, softball, you name it. Men's basketball is playing tonight. So what do you guys got coming up this
It's
week?
just about our busiest week of the year. So I'll have an article later about spring practice, and
Which starts tomorrow.
which starts tomorrow
On Thursday.
Yeah, so there's an open practice session tomorrow at 9:30 that we'll get to go to. Obviously, they're just going to be in shorts and t-shirts, and there's not going to be any one-on-one stuff.
Right.
So we won't get to see anything, but we'll be able to tell like the basic depth chart just based on the order in which guys go through drills.
Yeah.
But there won't be a lot to see. But at the same time, you know, you get it started. Here we were a month from the spring game.
Yeah.
So, and then obviously decent amount of basketball being played this week too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bad men's basketball at Cincinnati tonight, Wednesday. Women, 5:30, Friday. There's obviously another game, USC, South Dakota State.
And I think it's a foregone conclusion that women will play on Sunday.
Yes. And there's a chance that the men are in Castle on Saturday if they
How
win.
about Hofstra beating Rutgers, making the
that
NIT a little
was
more
kinda nuts.
interesting?
Yeah, if Tech wins tonight at Cincinnati, you can like pitch your tent next to Castle for the whole weekend.
That sounds pretty good.
Not a bad weekend of basketball.
Yeah, not at all. I talked yesterday to Travis Wells. I interviewed him for actually a class assignment, and he has just about the busiest week you could possibly ask for with football starting, and he's in charge of so that Carter Brown can just handle Virginia Tech women's basketball. He's overseeing the entire hosting of the NCAA tournament. So he's in charge of USC, South Dakota State, Tech, and Chattanooga. So he's got himself a gauntlet of a week. Everybody in the SID office does. So credit to them. Guys, thank you so much. Any final remarks before we let them go?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well.
Cool. All right. Well, that'll do it for episode 289 of the Tech Sideline Podcast, presented by First Bank and Trust Company and the Hokie Way. Thanks so much for watching and listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube, and we'll see you next time for the Tech Sideline Podcast right here from Blacksburg.